So, what if the most foundational truth, like the core principle you base your entire life on,
Yeah.
was actually just a mistranslation by a 17th century politician?
I mean, it is a wild thing to think about. We rarely inspect the bedrock of our own worldview.
Right, we just kind of build the house and hope the ground holds.
Yeah.
But today, we're taking you, the learner, right into the architecture of belief itself.
Hmm.
We're exploring this fascinating and sometimes really painful process called deconstruction.
Which, even if you don't consider yourself religious or spiritual at all, it's an absolute masterclass in critical thinking. It requires an incredible amount of psychological
Well,
endurance.
absolutely.
And it is important to clarify that deconstruction, especially how we're examining it today, it isn't about throwing a tantrum. It's not about just abandoning belief entirely.
Right, it's more like a meticulous audit of your reality. You take the engine of your worldview apart piece by piece to see which gears actually turn the wheels.
Exactly. And which parts were just, shoved in there by an institution trying to maintain control.
And our source material for this audit today is this incredibly candid excerpt from a YouTube interview series. It's called Discovering God Together.
Hosted by Steve Reed, right?
Yeah. And he sits down with a guest, John Robertson, to kind of map out John's personal blueprint of deconstruction. So, okay, let's unpack this. Because to really grasp how John took his belief system apart, we have to understand the specific concrete it was built with.
You have to know what you're tearing down.
Yeah.
And John was raised in what he describes as a legalistic Baptist home near Boston, which really sets the stage for massive cognitive friction later on.
Totally.
Yeah.
And when we say legalistic in a theological context, we're talking about a highly transactional framework, right?
Exactly. It operates on this strict checklist of behaviors. If you follow rule A, you earn divine approval B.
And if you break rule C, you get divine wrath D. It's very cut and dry.
And John notes that growing up, he didn't even recognize this as a specific, rigid framework. He just assumed it was the default operating system of the universe.
Right. I mean, you don't question gravity in your own house. It's just there.
Uh,
But then John grew up, life shifted, and he got married and moved down to Kentucky for a job.
which puts him in a vulnerable position. He's hunting for a new community.
And this leads to what John calls his dueling banjos story.
Uh,
I love this story because it perfectly illustrates how easily we get swept up into new systems when we're feeling adrift.
the psychology of belonging is just so powerful.
It really is. So John and his wife are driving around this small Kentucky town looking for a rental house, and they take this side road.
Yeah, and as they drive, the road just gets narrower and narrower. It turns from pavement into dirt.
And John's anxiety just completely spikes. I mean, he's a guy from Boston, deep in rural Kentucky, and his brain is just stereotyping the whole situation. He literally thinks to himself, I hear dueling banjos.
He is fully anticipating hostility, but the road dead ends straight into a guy's driveway.
Right, and there's a man out there working on his truck. So John gets out of the car, fully bracing for an uncomfortable confrontation.
But instead of hostility, the guy wiping grease off his hands turns out to be the associate pastor of the local Church of God.
It's a complete inversion of what he expected. And the pastor just casually invites them to a Wednesday night service.
And when they show up, the head pastor does something totally unorthodox.
This is where it gets crazy.
Right. He looks at John, this brand new stranger in the pews, decides to scrap the planned format of the service on a whim, and physically passes the microphone to John.
He just hands him the mic to introduce himself to the congregation. Imagine the dopamine hit of that moment.
Oh, yeah.
You go from anticipating hostility on a dirt road to being handed a microphone and instantly validated by a community leader. That single mic pass sparked an 8-year journey.
He built his entire life around that Church of God. He bought a house down the street, and it became his new foundation.
But, foundations have to weather real life.
And real life brought some serious turbulence. John eventually goes through a really difficult divorce. He enters this period where he just feels completely adrift.
Right, he moves back east to Cape Cod, stays single for years, but eventually he does remarry.
Yeah, a wonderful relationship that's lasted like 18 years now. And the two of them try to plug back into that familiar system of community.
They find this church in Hyannis with a vibrant Brazilian demographic and a young pastor. They're basically back on the treadmill.
Which brings up a really crucial mechanism about how belief systems sustain themselves.
Exactly. Religion, much like a demanding career or a complex relationship, it operates heavily on sheer momentum. You wake up, You drive to the physical building, you sing the designated songs.
You contribute to the massive monthly mortgage of the facility.
Yes, you just don't have the cognitive bandwidth to inspect the machinery of your theology because you are entirely consumed with the physical act of running the machine.
But then COVID acts as this global pause button. The physical building closes, the momentum just snaps.
And without that weekly behavioral reinforcement, the mind suddenly has all this empty space.
Interestingly, though, it wasn't John who started the questioning. It was his wife.
Right. She started finding this deconstruction movement online and bringing these new perspectives to him. And John's initial biological reaction was intense resistance.
Oh, yeah. He explicitly told her, oh, for Pete's sake, stop it. I am not going there.
He was absolutely terrified of losing the structural integrity of his reality.
Exactly. When new information threatens a foundational belief, the human brain doesn't just process it as a mild curiosity. It processes it as a literal threat to survival.
The amygdala fires up.
Right. It's what we call cognitive dissonance. It feels like a software system freezing because it's trying to run two mutually exclusive codes at the exact same time.
And the brain's immediate defense mechanism is to just reject the new code, right? To protect the existing operating system.
Exactly. But because of the pandemic pause, John couldn't just bury himself in volunteer work at the church building to distract his brain.
He was forced to just sit in his living room and actually let his wife's findings seep in. So he starts reading. He revisits that famous book, The Shack, by William Paul Young.
He dives into study guides, and he picks up a book by Jason Clark called God is Not in Control.
Which forces a massive transition. He goes from simply asking when the theological engine was built to dismantling the most heavily fortified part of it.
The theology of control.
Right, because if you realize the walls around your worldview can be lowered, the biggest existential threat just walks right through the front door.
And for John, this idea that a higher power micromanages every detail of the universe, it wasn't some abstract dorm room debate. The stakes were devastatingly real.
Yeah. John and his wife had previously lost their son to a drug overdose.
The profound agony of that, it really cannot be overstated. And in the source material, John details the coping mechanism they utilized to survive that unimaginable grief.
They used the ultimate theological safety net. They told themselves God called him home to protect him.
Because their son struggled deeply with addiction, framing his death as a divine intervention offered a layer of purpose over the tragedy.
Right. It requires the assumption that a grand architect is pulling the strings behind the scenes for some greater good. But I have to push back here on behalf of anyone listening who might be processing their own grief.
Go ahead.
Isn't it actually terrifying to relinquish that specific safety net? I mean, if John reads a book titled God is Not in Control and applies that thesis to the loss of his child...
It completely strips away the comfort of divine purpose.
Exactly. It forces him to admit that his child's death wasn't part of a grand, loving plan. It was just a biological failure, a tragic, senseless accident born of addiction. Why would anyone willingly walk into that level of existential freefall?
Because the alternative, forcing yourself to believe the safety net, it requires endless, exhausting mental gymnastics.
What do you mean?
Well, the human brain desperately craves pattern matching. We abhor a vacuum of meaning, so we invent narratives to explain random chaos. But think about the psychological toll of John's original narratives.
If God is in absolute control,
then God intentionally orchestrated a fatal overdose for a struggling addict. To maintain that belief, John has to constantly defend a deity who acts in ways we would consider horrific if a human parent did them.
oh wow, so the safety net is actually a trap.
Exactly. Giving up the everything happens for a reason narrative, it causes immense anguish initially, because you have to face the raw, unvarnished chaos of the world.
But eventually, according to John's journey, it leads to a much deeper, less intellectually conflicted sense of peace. You let tragedy just be tragedy. You don't have to defend the indefensible anymore.
You remove the cognitive friction entirely. You stop trying to force pure love and horrific tragedy to equal the same thing.
And once John realized he had permission to question the foundational idea of God's control, causality naturally forces the next question.
Right. If God isn't pulling the strings of earthly tragedy, how can he be pulling the levers of eternal torture?
Which leads directly to a total reevaluation of hell. John struggled deeply with the traditional concept of eternal conscious torment.
He uses two very different examples from the source material to highlight how the logic of hell completely failed him. The first is Jeffrey Dahmer.
Right. And John acknowledges the absolute horror of Dahmer's actions. But he takes a step back to look at the mechanics of human behavior.
He argues that for a human being to commit those acts, their biological and psychological machinery must be fundamentally broken. There is a profound chemical or experiential dysfunction there.
And John simply could not reconcile a deity of pure, unconditional love, sending a broken human being to be tortured eternally for actions stemming from a sickness they essentially had zero control over.
The punishment just doesn't fit the mechanism of the crime.
And the second example John brings up is almost the inverse of the Dahmer situation. He recalls sitting in Sunday school as a kid being taught that people living out in remote jungles.
People who had simply never been exposed to the Christian gospel.
Exactly, that they were also condemned to hell.
The ultimate penalty applied on a geographical technicality.
It's like being sentenced to life in prison for failing to sign a contract that was never even printed, let alone mailed to you. It offends the most basic human sense of fairness.
It's a complete short circuit of the traditional narrative. And this is where Steve, the host of the YouTube series, introduces linguistic context that completely reframes John's doubt.
Yeah, this part is wild.
What's fascinating here is how Steve utilized academic history to solve a theological crisis. He explains that he started taking his own questions back past the modern English translations, looking directly at the original Greek and Hebrew manuscripts.
And he discovered that the English word hell, the way modern culture pictures it with fire and eternal torture, it doesn't even exist in the original texts at all.
Not at all. Which begs the question, how did it get into the English Bible?
Right.
Steve notes that in the ancient manuscripts there are 4 distinct words, 1 in Hebrew and 3 in Greek. And over centuries of translation, these 4 highly nuanced words were all flattened and merged into the single English word hell.
But originally, none of those ancient words described eternal conscious torment.
Exactly. They pointed toward concepts of a refining fire. Think of the mechanics of smelting gold. You heat it up to burn off the impurities so the pure element remains.
The original linguistic intent was about cleansing and reclaiming, not endless punitive torture. This really highlights the immense danger of biblical literalism.
It really does. In the source material, John and Steve bring up the demographic of people who insist on using the King James only version of the Bible.
People who treat that specific English translation as the flawless, direct voice of the divine. They point out how absurd it is to take translations literally, like the verse telling you to pluck your eye out if it causes you to sin.
But if we look at the actual mechanism of how the King James Bible was created,
treating that text as unvarnished absolute truth is like trusting a PR campaign orchestrated by a 17th century politician.
that historical context changes everything. King James literally appointed a committee of men to compile, translate, and edit a narrative. Why?
To consolidate political authority over a fractured empire.
Exactly. They chose specific words to centralize power and emphasize institutional compliance. To swallow that political document as the original source code without checking the underlying data is a massive blind spot.
And to combat that blind spot, John and Steve discuss alternative resources that bypass that institutional filter. They recommend a work of fiction called Patmos by Baxter Kruger.
Which explores the final days of the Apostle John to capture the essence of the first century before religion became a state-sponsored institution.
But the tool that stands out the most is a project by François Dutoit called the Mirror Bible.
It's an app-based translation directly from the Greek, and the mechanism of how it works is brilliant.
Dutoit doesn't just hand you a finished English sentence and expect you to trust him. He provides extreme transparency.
He breaks down the original Greek word, explains the historical context of how that word was used in everyday first-century life, and then explains exactly why he chose his specific English translation.
It forces the reader to engage with the nuance of the language rather than just swallowing a finalized doctrine. So we've audited the theology of control, dismantled hell, and exposed the political mechanics of translation.
But the listener might be asking, what does this actually look like in practice? How does completely gutting your existential worldview change how you live on a random Tuesday?
Right.
Well, it radically alters the mechanics of community. John and his wife no longer attend a physical church building. They have shifted to the concept of an ecclesia.
Which is the original Greek word that eventually got translated into church.
Correct, but the original utility of an ecclesia was completely different. It didn't mean a massive building with a multi-million-dollar mortgage.
Or highly produced weekly stage show and a single authority figure.
Right. The ecclesia was a decentralized gathering of people meeting in homes, mutually supporting each other's daily lives. John found his modern version of this decentralized community online through Jason Clark's group and the writings of Dr. Debbie McFarland.
And this decentralized, low-anxiety approach bleeds directly into how they process the chaotic world around them, especially politics. Now, as a strict rule on this show, um, we remain entirely neutral. We are not endorsing any political ideology or candidate.
Right. We are simply examining the psychological mechanism of how John's deconstructed worldview handles political stress.
Exactly. And he explicitly states that he refuses to get upset over who occupies the White House. Regardless of whether he personally likes the politician or not, his perspective is one of radical detachment from macro anxiety.
Steve actually brings up a great contrasting example. His 96-year-old mother consumes news podcasts all day long and exists in a state of high stress, convinced the world is perpetually on the brink of ending.
Wow.
But Steve and John share a unified philosophy against this. True change does not happen by agonizing over national news cycles or trying to force world peace on a massive scale.
Things you mathematically have zero control over.
Exactly. True change happens on the micro level. It's the daily practice of accepting love and reflecting it back to the specific individuals standing right in front of you.
It is incredibly practical. But it does leave us with one final lingering tension. If God isn't a dictator controlling the macro events of the universe, how do you explain the famous Bible verse that says, "I know the plans I have for you"?
Right, the plan.
Here's where it gets really interesting. John and his wife were having morning coffee, grappling with this exact paradox. If there is no divine control, how can there possibly be a divine plan?
And the mechanism his wife uses to reframe this concept completely resolves the philosophical dead end.
She asked John to think about the hopes and dreams a parent has for their child. As a parent, you might have a deeply thought-out plan for your kid.
You might set up a college fund, encourage a certain career path, or hope they marry a specific type of person.
But the child doesn't have to follow it. A mandate requires compliance for validation. But a parent's plan provides a framework for flourishing while allowing total autonomy.
You can have a beautiful plan for someone without forcing them to execute it. That cognitive shift changes the fundamental relationship of theology.
It moves it from master and puppet to parent and independent child.
John talks about the immense freedom he feels as a grandparent now. He gets to just love his grandkids without the agonizing pressure of controlling their every outcome.
And he has taken that exact lens and applied it to how he views the universe.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, what John and Steve are modeling is vital for anyone undergoing a paradigm shift. Steve explicitly warns against the knee-jerk reaction many people have when they discover flaws in their foundation.
The instinct is to grab the sledgehammer, to throw out God, throw out Jesus, and collapse into complete cynicism.
Instead of a wrecking ball, they advocate for archaeological excavation. You don't burn the site down, you dig past the debris to find the original source.
For Steve and John, that means looking at ancient Greek texts or learning to trust the source within you.
That internal compass of intuition and truth, rather than relying on external institutional mandates.
And you, listening right now, do not have to be unpacking a religious upbringing to utilize this exact psychological toolkit. The framework of returning to the original source code to clear away centuries of institutional clutter is incredibly valuable for any aspect of your life.
Whether it's the economic principles you operate under, the cultural norms you perform, or the psychological scripts you inherited from your family.
It requires immense intellectual bravery. It is terrifying to journal your way out of a comfortable, deeply ingrained belief.
But the data from John's experience suggests the outcome is a worldview with significantly lower anxiety and a much higher capacity for genuine empathy.
We started this deep dive by questioning the concrete beneath our feet. We explored how mistranslations, the human desperation for pattern matching, and a 17th century political agenda altered the existential foundations for millions of people.
It really is a lot to process.
So I want to leave you with a provocation to mull over today. What deeply held truths in your own life, perhaps the unwritten rules of your specific industry, the rigid traditions of your family, or the punishing expectations you hold against yourself, are actually just mistranslations?
What rules are you following simply because you never bothered to check the original source code?
And what kind of reality might you be free to build if you dared to deconstruct them today?